Hello Vinaka and welcome to Talk Business, and if you're joining us from around the region, a big hello to you too. On the show tonight we cover the recent Pacific Science Inter-Congress and the research carried out by various academics into areas of economics, business, politics, energy and the environment. Talk Business examines the research at hand and takes a closer look at the current policy frameworks that are in need of change with feasible and practical solutions. Don't go anywhere, that's coming up in the next half hour. Australia has an interesting relationship with the Pacific. Not only is it seen as a big brother, but often viewed as a model for Pacific Island countries, especially when it comes to economic and political systems. It's also somewhat the standby piggy bank and helps the region's developing nations with donor funding in areas of infrastructure development, housing, education, and health. So its role in the Pacific's affairs, be it political or economic, is no doubt significant. A leading Australian academic recently presented an interesting paper titled Overseeing and Overlooking Australia's Shifting Engagement with the Pacific Islands at the recent Pacific Science Inter-Congress. He argued that Australia has a tendency to get involved in Pacific Island politics, but at the same time, it often overlooks issues. Simply because the Pacific doesn't always rank highly among Australia's foreign policy priorities. Take Fiji for example. Dr. Jonathan Schultz says Australia's stance since the events of 2006 is a huge matter of debate.
In 2006 we had Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, who had already taken a strong stance against what he saw as corruption and problems in other Pacific Island countries, notably in Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea. So when Commodore Bainimarama took power in 2006, Alexander Downer applied a template for response which was to be very firm and very not at all conciliatory, and that's what he did. I think in doing so he was also guided by the experience of previous coups in Fiji, which had resolved themselves fairly rapidly, and I don't think he ever imagined that in 2013 things would the relationship would still be in this kind of sort of frigid stage. I mean, granted there have been some signs of rapprochement, but they've hung so much on the restoration of democracy, meaning the holding of elections, which is not necessarily the same thing, but as long as there aren't elections, it's unlikely that Australia will change its stance very dramatically.
He believes the Australian public is largely divided on their views on Fiji.
Australians don't know very much about the Pacific, and I think they generally think that here is a military government and we don't like military governments. It's a small country, we have the power to try to change things, and so we should. There's certainly a very strong current of opinion that takes that position. I think there's another current of opinion that says, well, it hasn't helped, so what, and things haven't all become terrible in Fiji. Life still goes on, and there might be some things that we have a bit of a problem with, but it's far from, we're not talking about Syria or something here, so why not just be a bit more humble and say, okay, we'd like to open up again to having a normal kind of relationship.
Australia boasts a stable economy, one of the very few that made it through the GFC with minimal impact. But signs of sluggish growth this year is evident. Its gross domestic product rose 0.6% during the January-March quarter, and subsequently the Aussie dollar too has fallen, after only in 2010 historically strengthening against the greenback. But a drop in the AUD could have a significant impact on Pacific Island countries that peg their currencies and exports against it. It could also severely impact the flow of remittances, tourism, and trade.
With the falling Australian dollar, I think one could expect, the transmission mechanism to take place through slowing down, possible slowdown of number of tourists, who would be coming to the Pacific. With the high Australian dollar, it was cheaper for them to travel, and in fact we saw an increase in the visitor arrivals in some of the countries, and especially those arriving from Australia. It could also have an impact on remittances, when the Australian dollar is very high compared to Fijian dollar or other Pacific Island currencies. The motivation and the incentive for people to send remittances not only would increase in those countries, but also people who are receiving remittances in their own dollar terms would be actually getting more.
Now, that's not to say, though, that positives don't exist. A drop in the Aussie dollar could relate to some benefits.
It'd be cheaper to import. Our import bills are very high, and many Pacific Island countries, bulk of the imports come from Australia and New Zealand, and particularly Australia. So a falling Australian dollar could provide some space or cushion the high price of items that we import from Australia, particularly food. So it could have some impact on food price inflation, particularly in relation to imported food items.
At a time where an emerging power like China has made a flamboyant entry into the region, ensuring economic stability and political hegemony becomes all the more crucial.
Australia can't exactly tell the Pacific Islands that they not to have relations, and in fact, there's a strong body within thought within Australia that it's good for the Pacific Islands to diversify their foreign partners and stop seeing them as sort of I don't know, like children or something. I don't know, that they're capable of conducting grown-up foreign affairs too.
That ties in with the critical issue of foreign aid. Australia's estimated expenditure across the Pacific is around $1.259 billion for 2013 to the 2014 period. This figure makes Australia the leading donor across the region. In fact, almost 20% of the total Australian aid program is directed towards the Pacific. So what sort of impact could the gradual slowing down of the Australian economy have on Fiji and the Pacific, and even donor aid?
There's always, two sides to the story. I mean, I think the degree to which, how much the dollar fluctuates. If it goes down too soon and by a large percentage, then it could have a significant impact. But if it is slowing down in a way that it's not creating some kind of shock, then those small shocks and a trend shock would be absorbed in a way that Pacific Island countries would be able to deal with it.
A lot too depends on how sharp the dollar will decline and what cushioning effects the Pacific has.
There is debate about that in Australia itself, whether the prediction for a slowdown is correct or whether the economy is going to keep growing at more than 3%. So if there is a slowdown in the Australian economy itself, then again, we could have the similar kind of impact. I mean, if the economy there is not doing well, people's income will be affected. People will rethink about, strategies for the leisure, which means, number of tourists who might take the option of visiting, Pacific Island countries. All these variables are there. So the mechanism through which the impact of the declining Australian dollar and a slowing Australian economy or New Zealand economy would be through these mechanisms.
And while Pacific Island countries still largely depend on the Australian economy and often its government for direction, a sense of independence through regional groupings is slowly changing the region's political landscape, particularly so for the Melanesian Spearhead Group.
It's clear that the MSG is looking at getting a regional grouping that excludes Australia, and that's certainly that certainly is not really in Australia's immediate interest. Whether that means that Australia should be more conciliatory to Fiji is kind of another question. Maybe the Melanesian countries have to have their politics, and this kind of relationship with maybe it's not a bad thing that there's a little bit of tension between the countries. I mean, it's hard to see that it's actually done great harm, and maybe Pacific Island countries, it's good for them to show a little bit more of an independent voice, and this is an opportunity for them to do so.
There is much debate, though, on how our big brother should carry out its relations with the Pacific.
It needs to work out how to deal, to sit down and think more deeply about what's happening in Fiji. Clearly, it's not something that Australia likes, having a non-democratically elected government in the region, but at the same time, how much of it is Australia's business? So just have a good think about it. So it's more, I guess, about process. It's about how we go about thinking about Pacific policy, about how formulating it, and there's any number of ways we can think about doing that. Well, one example is to engage more with Pacific Island diaspora in Australia. They tend not to have much to do with, apart from a few notable examples like Bridge Lal, who is a very influential voice in Australia, and some others, but more generally, I don't think that the Samoan community, for example, in Australia, is politically engaged, and reaching a bit further afield and being more creative about how Australia thinks about the Pacific and how it formulates the policy.
Economics has become the answer to everything. It's the panacea where societies try to resolve all issues through the economic paradigm. But despite this, we still have global issues of unemployment, hunger, and poverty that economics has yet to address. This brings into question, why hasn't the economics, the market, management, and business systems delivered positive outcomes for society? Why have they failed? A renowned scholar says it's because our administrative authorities have only taken the economics component in dealing with these issues.
As we approach 2015, the Millennium Development Goals are coming into an end, and basically we're finding that on all indicators, both in the Pacific and in other parts of the world, many countries are not meeting the Millennium Development Goals on a range of indicators, from poverty to education to diseases to chronic illness and acute illnesses, biosecurity, and even sustainability of our environment. So what is happening here?
Perhaps it's time now to rethink our current systems and take a broader view beyond the realm of economics.
We need to bring in the social, political, and sustainability, ecological, into our understanding of what constitutes society, in which economics becomes one element. I'm not dismissing economics. Economics is important, but we need to look at broad understandings of things like social capital, not just human capital, because social capital is broader than individuals. It's the communities, it's the families, it's the society. So challenging the current assumptions around economics to deliver more positive and quality of life outcomes.
Apart from taking a holistic approach by means of promoting inclusive growth, planning and assessing risks, be it the government or private sector, is imperative. Dr. Gurmeet Singh will argue that this is where many Pacific Island countries fail.
And many organizations, do a lot of planning without looking into the intricacies of the projects and the organizations, without calculating the risk associated with the projects. So what happens? Most of these organizations, they end up spending more time and energy on planning than on other important aspects of the projects. So I'm not saying that planning is not important. Planning is very essential for the management, but we have to look at the project from risk point of view.
Now there's an interesting phenomena that another academic has realized. infotainment, a term Dr. Narayan Gopal Krishnan crafted some 7 years ago that deals with how people use fear to their advantage. It's the fear factor that controls people and their perception on issues.
There's a lot of use of fear which is happening around us. Now, it's not just fear being used in a very simple way. It's a very complex way by which, and I use the term infotainment, basically looking at fear as a way of containing people as well as entertaining them. So I mean, you see the films, you might watch programs like Fear Factor, you might watch programs like these, and they seem fairly straightforward. They scare, they make you very scared. But what's happening in life around us is that powerful people in society are actually making us scared of many things.
What infotainment does is that it polarizes people on two sides of an argument by using fear and causing all kinds of chaos.
Most of these things, the truth is somewhere in between. But by using this idea of infotainment, we're polarizing people. We're putting them on two sides of an argument. And that doesn't help in terms of the important decisions we have to make. Now, more and more as I look at it, it's in politics, in the media, in terms of what's happening in our day-to-day lives, this use of infotainment is something we have to challenge, because the moment it happens, you've got two options. You can either run away from the fear or you can fight the fear.
Policymakers tend to play into what infotainment does. This can be detrimental, especially for a region like the Pacific.
Now, in the Pacific, there are very limited resources. There's not such a lot of resources. So we need to make the most of the use of the resources we have. Now, if we start making fearful responses, we won't make the best use of it. We'll make responses that are based on who we like, who we don't like, what ideas people will tell me to be very afraid of somebody. So I'll take a knee-jerk response based on that, instead of thinking it through and understanding where the real solutions are. So there's very complex issues involved with this idea.
How can societies then safeguard themselves from the impacts of infotainment?
Well, for one, understand it. And I think the use of this kind of a word which brings together that whole phenomena is important. That's why I use it. I didn't craft the word just for the sake of crafting a word, but to understand a very complex phenomena in a very simple way, so that when you see it happening, when someone is radicalizing young people saying that do this, or somebody's making a story, good versus bad, you can just, label it. That is infotainment, and straight away say, look, this is not something that is right, we need to challenge it. So one, understand it. Two, understand in what situations is it most dramatic. And I would say in times of crisis in society, if there's a tsunami, if there's a war happening, all of these kind of things are the times we have to be most careful. Say there are elections going to happen. Those are the kind of times that people have to be very careful of the use of infotainment, challenge it, bring it out in the open, say that it's infotainment, because that will hold people back. Once they understand, look, these people are understanding what I'm doing, so I should not do that. So it's important to name it and shame it in those kind of circumstances.
Turning green is the way to go. It's a trend that many have caught on. In a bid to reduce one's carbon footprint, industry and commerce are largely at the forefront. Going green means a reduction in energy consumption and overall cutback in the use of fossil fuels. But how do you measure this drop in energy usage? This is where energy audits come in. A recent study carried out by the School of Engineering and Physics at the USP into energy consumption levels in hotels around the country has netted some interesting preliminary results. An analysis of 2 hotels of the same star rating saw a difference in energy consumption levels.
At the moment, it seems that this sort of energy audit and the of energy consumption and working out energy indicators which will help us to compare the usage of energy by 2 different hotels is a very productive one for Fiji and for the whole of the Pacific Island countries.
For the tourism industry and other businesses, how important could an energy audit be? to the bottom line.
After you've done the energy audit, you realize the benefits that can accrue. You suddenly realize the inefficiencies inherent in the equipment that you've been using, the procedures, the operation and maintenance, and the operations that you've been using. And you usually you wonder why you hadn't done this before. So there's a lot of advantages, not only economic, but of course there is, if you use less energy, it automatically means low consumption of fossil fuels in our case, and this means savings in real dollars.
Now for tourism specifically, there's an area of growth. Low carbon tourism is a global movement that promotes environmental friendliness, where tourists opt to travel to destinations that help conserve energy. It's a conscious decision in helping reduce carbon emissions. This could possibly be a niche the Pacific can easily carve.
Fiji could act as a model or a case study for the whole of the Pacific region, because what we have in Fiji is a very diverse geology, and it's volcanic islands in some places, and we have coral atolls in other places. And therefore the way we use energy is different, or generate energy is different. But we have similarities with other Pacific Island countries, and therefore we can have case studies here which we can compare with the other Pacific Island neighbors.
However, for tourism operators, there's that delicate balance, conserving energy without compromising the guest experience. How do you strike that equilibrium?
Let's say reducing the AC units, they may not be particularly efficient, because as the comfort of the guest should not be compromised, in fact. And however, some other areas such as in management, administration, and probably reception areas where less occupancy occurs, there exists quite a large amount of energy savings possible through retrofits, in fact.
There hasn't been a noticeable transition towards renewable energy in our tourism sector, as the initial survey has revealed. It's a trend academics are hoping to change with some solid analysis.
What you're going to do is to show how energy savings can accrue from renewable energy, and whether it's cost effective or not.
But it all boils down to capital investment. Dr. Singh says the infrastructure cost of renewable energy has substantially reduced. Now businesses can also pursue the option of selling excess energy to the Electricity Authority, transferring it to the national grid as independent power producers.
What has happened is one of the easiest way to produce renewable energy, it would be through photovoltaics, solar photovoltaics. And up till recently, what was happening was that because of the costs of installation of these, the installation itself was so high, it wasn't possible. But recently the costs have come down, and it's quite possible now for hotels and private accommodation to install rooftop solar panels, and to actually connect to the grid and sell to the grid.
And that's all for this week. For questions or comments, do email us, talkbusiness@fijitv.com.fj. Remember, you can view what you've just seen on our website. That's www.fijitv.info, and follow the links to Talk Business. Thank you for joining us. Do join us again at the same time next week. Until then, have a productive week.